I'm Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning. All of you from within our community here in Connecticut and those joining from around the United States, from the East Coast to Alaska. Our conversation this morning on race, resistance, and community is part of our day of dialogue, which also features a workshop on race and a national student conversation. Thank you to Trinity College Center for Urban and Global Studies for your support today. This is a critical moment. We know our country is in crisis and we are in pain. Since the public killing of George Floyd, we are reeling. But times of crisis can often be an opportunity for great change. As an organization that was founded in 1924 with the fundamental ideal of making the world a more peaceful place, we take our role as a community convener with great responsibility. If you want to read our statement, Racism in America is a Global Issue, we'll share it with you in the chat below. In this important moment, we are seeing clearly the overt and systematic racial injustice that exists in our nation and within our communities. And as I sit here in my office in the Asylum Hill neighborhood in Hartford, I am sitting in a place that has one of the largest income and wealth gaps in the United States and one of the largest achievement gaps, which means that as I sit here, our schools remain segregated. The World Affairs Council of Connecticut is committed to being part of the seismic change that needs to occur to make our community a more just place. Not only with the events of today, which are one step, but in a sustained and ongoing way. Today, we're here to discuss, here with us today is Dr. Peniel Joseph and Jay Williams. We're gonna encourage all of you in our listening audience to use the Q&A feature. We want to hear from you. And if we don't get to all of the questions, we want to use them to guide us as we go forward. And I also want to encourage you to use the chat function to interact with all of your other fellow audience members and to do so respectfully. So I'm delighted to welcome Peniel and Jay with us today. Dr. Peniel Joseph is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts. His most recent book, just published, is The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and examines the political lives of two social movement leaders who assumed divergent but critically similar roles. And it has amazing reviews, and we are putting a link to get it in our chat below. And Jay Williams is the president of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. In his role, he has been working to build stronger relationships between the foundation and local communities it serves. He is currently leading the foundation's efforts to address disparities in our community based on race, ethnicity, place, and income. And prior to coming to the Hartford Foundation, Jay served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development and the Deputy Director of the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House. And he was also the Mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you. And Dr. Joseph, you also, thank you.
So I want to start by asking each of you to sort of give a brief summary of what your thoughts are today. What are you thinking about this moment that we are in? Dr. Joseph, I want to start with you.
Sure. Thank you to the World Affairs Council for this invitation. I think we're at a critical moment. I think that we have a generational opportunity to transform American democracy. I think we should be very hopeful and inspired and optimistic about the protests and the demonstrations that we're seeing. I think we have to be honest about why these are happening. George Floyd's tragic death has inspired massive peaceful protests, but they've been contoured by some outbursts of violence. And sometimes we want to focus on the violence and not the origin of the protests in and of themselves. So I think that what's very critically important for everybody here who's on this webinar, who wants to do change and wants to fight for justice, to understand that this is really something very, very hopeful. We've seen the multiracial character of the protest. This is about more than just the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system in the United States is a gateway to panoramic systems of racial and economic oppression, that include social welfare, that include housing affordability, that include education. This is about all of us transforming really the thousands of policy decisions that we've made since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, all the way up until George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, that have really resulted in, this is more than just racial disparities. This is institutional racism and white supremacy, but we can actually eradicate white supremacy. We can eradicate institutional racism. It's the work of a generation, but we can build Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community, a community that's multiracial, that's multicultural, that's multi-ethnic, that's multi-religious, that's multi-gendered and sexual orientation. We can create that community where we support each other, where we have deep empathy for each other, where we create policies that actually are very inclusive and expansive and open. We don't build walls to separate each other. We don't segregate our public schools or segregate our neighborhoods. We don't have pockets of prosperity against great searing wildernesses of racial discrimination and economic impoverishment. So we have a chance to seize the time, and I'll close by saying this is a generational opportunity to complete the work of the New Deal, the Great Society, the War on Poverty, to create that beloved community in our own time, whether you're in Austin, Texas, where I'm at, or if you're in Hartford or wherever you are around the nation. This is a wake-up call for all of us to do more and to do more good in the world.
Thank you. Jay?
I agree with everything that Dr. Joseph said. I believe and feel that we stand at an inflection point where there is an opportunity to experience a generational shift in how we have both perceived, understood, and acted against this system of racial, this structural problem of and institutional racism and inequities that have existed in this country. For far too long, this was dismissed or perceived as perhaps a cosmetic problem, something that if we just tweaked around the edges, that we could somehow, if we marched long enough or protested long enough or had slow and steady progress, that we would ultimately achieve what Dr. King spoke of. I think finally we are at a point where more and more people are seeing this for the structural problem that it is. And anyone who has owned a home or lived in an apartment understands that there is no short, inexpensive, convenient way to deal with a structural problem. When you have a structural problem, you have to take the entity down to its studs oftentimes. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what has to happen here, that the manifestations that we've seen most recently in the killing of George Floyd, Aubrey, and the character assault on Christian Cooper, these are the instances that have been caught virally and that have absolutely justifiably enraged thousands and tens of thousands and millions of people across the country and across the world. But for every one of those instances, there are arguably 10 instances that were not caught on camera, that did not evoke the type of visceral reaction that is so justifiably going on across this country. So we do stand, I believe, at an inflection point. And the idea that this is a structural, deeply rooted problem that is ingrained in the foundation of this country, that will only be excised if there is a persistent, ongoing push, and that it is seen and felt as something that is inescapable for all of us. So to that end, while I am frustrated and angry and have a lot of complex feelings, I am also hopeful that we will begin to achieve the dream and the vision of Dr. King and so many others. And not until, again, that there is an understanding of the experiences of Black and African-American men and women and families who have for generations been plagued by this in this country, others of color and sexual orientation and gender who are also have experienced similar outcomes and impacts. So I'm grateful to be here, and I hope that these moments turn into a sustained movement, and that movement truly moves us to the justice and morality that is so often spoke about in this country, but too infrequently and unfortunately experienced and lived by Blacks and other people of color.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. What I think that we'll do today is have Dr. Joseph walk us through, some of the history of how we got here today, and then have Jay follow up with what does this look like in our community, and what are some of the things we can do about it, and then come back together and discuss ways forward. So, Dr. Joseph, it is impossible to walk us through centuries of history right now. But I'm wondering if you can outline for us a few of the cornerstones of the, overt and systematic racism in the U.S. that have led us here today.
Yeah, so, and I actually had something ready, but I'll just speak. I wrote a Boston Globe op-ed that people can check out that's on exactly this. And I've done some op-eds for the Washington Post and others about this. When we think about this moment, we really have to recall the period of Reconstruction. And just to let everybody know, Reconstruction is the aftermath of the Civil War, which was 1861 to 1865. Over 700,000 Americans died in that war. And that was a war over racial slavery. It wasn't a war over states' rights. It was a war over whether or not our democracy would be a democracy that held African Americans as enslaved chattel, or was it going to be a democracy that lived up to the creed of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And we chose one course. We won the war. Freedom won the war, but the Confederacy really won the peace. And Reconstruction was the effort from 1865, really all the way to 1896 to reimagine American democracy. Sometimes we say 1865 to 1877, and we call the other 19 years the period of redemption, or the white redeemer South. I push back against that because I think that 30-year period is more important, that 31-year period, because that's an effort where we're going to see the creation of historically Black colleges and universities. We're going to see the rise of African-American churches being institutionalized, even though the African-American church had always existed, even during 1619 to the present. But Reconstruction is important because that was our first effort at interracial democracy. And it's important for us to understand that the criminal justice system that we have today is a direct result of the Reconstruction period. So Reconstruction, instead of having African-American freedom, voting rights, and liberty, what you got was convict leasing, patronage, and peonage. And so when you, and sharecropping and peonage. So when you think about convict leasing, this was when African-American men and women were arrested for loitering, were arrested for being unemployed, and then they were leased out to private companies to work in mines and to work in different industries. And those industries actually paid those municipalities money, fines, and fees. And this is connected to what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, and what the Department of Justice found out in Ferguson in 2014 and 15. So when we think about convict leasing, sharecropping, Black labor, instead of being liberated after the Civil War, 4 million free Black men and women, was actually constrained after the Civil War, with only really tens of thousands, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching crusader, who have enough freedom to be educators, to be business leaders, to be doctors, to go to university. Most go to historically Black colleges and universities, but some, like Du Bois, even get to Harvard University, right? So when we think about that period connects to now. The next period I'm going to talk about after 1865 to 1896 is really, and 1896 is important because of Plessy versus Ferguson. We institutionalized Jim Crow racial segregation through a Supreme Court decision that says that separate but equal is constitutional, right? And so the next period I'll talk about is really the early 20th century. We have a great migration in the early 20th century. Millions of African Americans go from the rural South to not just the urban North, but the Midwest, cities like Chicago, cities like Detroit, and they're looking for a new way. They go to Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, and what they do is both create new foundations for American democracy, but they come up against really the first wave of the urban criminalization of Black bodies, the early 20th century. The great book here is Khalil Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness to get, if people want to really find out more about this history. Another book is Sarah Haley's No Mercy here, about African-American women in Atlanta and other places who were circumscribed by the criminal justice system. Another book is Talitha LaFleur's Chained in Silence, about Black women in Georgia and other places. So even as Black people helped fight in World War I, fight in World War II, we have to understand that the criminal justice system was criminalizing them even in the early 20th century, even during the Great Depression, the Second World War. Now, when we think about the civil rights movement, we all here have heard about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The civil rights movement and what I call the heroic period of the civil rights movement, between the Brown desegregation decision all the way to the Voting Rights Act, is this enormous period of social protest and movement to try to transform American democracy. We get the Civil Rights Act, we get the Voting Rights Act, the Great Society, the War on Poverty. People erroneously think that the civil rights movement provided guarantees of Black citizenship and voting rights. It did not. The civil rights movement made watershed victories, but what we'll see is that the Great Society quickly transformed from a war on poverty to a war on crime. 2 months after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, on June 19th, Lyndon Johnson and Congress, they signed a Safe Streets Omnibus Crime Bill in 1968, which puts the federal government in the business of granting grants for crime control. Over the last 52 years, what we've seen is the creation of this monstrosity. The investments that were supposed to go in anti-racism, anti-poverty, early childhood education, decent housing for all, what Martin Luther King Jr. called radical Black citizenship, have instead gone into creating the biggest carceral state in the world, right? And so what we've seen is a criminalization of Black people over the last 52 years in a bipartisan fashion. The current president isn't the first president to talk about law and order. That was Richard Nixon. But in a bipartisan way, it's not just Richard Nixon and George Wallace, and it's not just Ronald Reagan. It is going to be Bill Clinton and others who also talk about crime control, bringing hundreds of thousands of new cops into the street, flooding racially segregated and impoverished ghettos in the United States, not with books, not with jobs, not with gardens, but flooding them with surveillance and incarceration, to the point that we created a system that is arresting 5- and 6-year-old Black girls and boys in public schools, and we normalized that system. So what we did was we created a gargantuan system of punishment, incarceration, trauma, and death for Black people. Not just the disproportionate numbers of Black men and women who are in jails and in prisons, 2.3 million people in prison, 40% African American, but those who are on parole, probation, and are part of a supply chain of grief that the criminal justice system sets up. So when people ask me, what can we do now? We have to do several things. One, we have to end these racist policies in the criminal justice system. But we also have to end the supply chain of grief that these racist policies are connected to. Criminal justice is connected to our public schools. It's connected to what our children can and cannot eat. It's connected to the disproportionate numbers of African American children who have asthma. It's connected to domestic violence in this country. It's connected to so many systems, and like what Jay was talking about, structures of oppression, that we're not just talking about unwinding the criminal justice system. We're saying we have to fundamentally reimagine American democracy. Everybody on the webinar who's wondering, what can we do? There are so many different resources right in Hartford where you're at, and Jay is one of them, where you can invest. I mean, we have to invest locally. The federal government right now is broken and dysfunctional. Does the next election count? Of course it does. But our civic responsibility as citizens starts at home. Like the great Tip O'Neill said, all politics are local, right? And so we have to transform our city councils. We have to transform our local alder women and aldermen. We have to elect different judges, but we also have to have compassion for African American people. And yes, for people of other races, but it starts with Black people, because Black people are the lowest common denominator of racial and economic and gendered and sexualized oppression in the United States of America.
Dr. Joseph, I'd be remiss because I know you are known as the global expert on Black Power movements. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about resistance movements today and how the legacies of Dr. King and Malcolm X are reflected in them.
Yeah, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is really important to this, this national massive mobilization that we're seeing. Malcolm X talked about radical Black dignity. Dr. King talked about radical Black citizenship. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has infused the nonviolent civil disobedience that King talked about with the structural critique of American racism, of white supremacy that Malcolm X was very much known for. So I think that what's so interesting about these contemporary movements is that they've added to that by talking about intersectional justice, race, class, gender, sexual orientation. So we're talking about the movement that we're seeing on the street is with LGBTQ, it's with white allies, Latinx. People are talking about mental health and trauma. People talk about food justice. People are talking about zoning policies and neighborhood density and building corridors where African Americans get access to predominantly white neighborhoods and predominantly white schools. One of the things we see about poverty in the country, it is racially segregated poverty. Poor whites have more access to affluent white communities. And I see it right here in Austin, in Hyde Park, in Tarrytown, where you have poor whites who have informal ways to rent homes and apartments in predominantly white, high achieving areas that there is absolutely no African-American corollary to. So this is a very, very deep-seated problem. But the movements that we're seeing now, very, very important. Some of them are multiracial, multicultural. We're seeing young white people who are connecting their individual stories with the collective history of African-American resistance and see their stories in our stories. And it really, really is very, very heartening and hopeful. This is the first time in American history where we've seen something triggered by racial injustice, this much multiracial and multi-generational character coming out. And remember, much of the demonstrations have actually been peaceful. The media and journalists are focusing on violence as a story and as a narrative and as a thread, but the through line here is resistance to racial injustice, economic impoverishment, and really a push for intersectional justice. And I think that's what these movements have been inspired for. And certainly the Black Power movement, the civil rights movement, these are movements that were part of intersectional injustice, and people have amplified that call now.
Thank you so much. We just heard so much from Dr. Joseph. Jay, can you talk a little bit about how racial inequality manifests itself here in our community and maybe provide some concrete examples of how we see the disparities today?
Sure. And part of the challenge here is that these racial injustices and inequalities sometimes manifest themselves in very overt ways, which we can react to and which cause us to begin to perhaps think differently or act differently. But too often they manifest themselves in very subtle ways and ways that, as Dr. Joseph talked about, almost become normal and typical. And we don't see them for the insidious race-based disparities and inequities that they are. A couple of examples are similar or identical actions that are perceived vastly differently depending on who is involved in it. An example that is currently being talked about is the Colin Kaepernick and Drew Brees. Drew Brees can express an opinion on something that he sees in one way and be seen as a person who is entitled to his opinion, as a person who is expressing his dissatisfaction with something or satisfaction with something. And Colin Kaepernick was vilified for expressing his rejection of racial injustices, not only vilified up into including the current occupant of the White House, but was basically blackballed and not be able to be employed in a multi-billion-dollar industry. Another example is the crack epidemic in the 90s was seen as a crime problem. It was a drug problem that we needed to punish the perpetrators, the users, the dealers. We needed more police officers, we needed more jails, and that was seen as a problem primarily in the African-American community of people making poor choices and doing things that they deserve to be punished. And in the last few years, the opioid epidemic all of a sudden became a health crisis. Instead of a crime problem, it was a health problem. And we needed to have compassion, and we needed to have funding and rehabilitation, and we needed to think differently about how this was impacting and tearing apart those neighborhoods that weren't the same initially inner city urban neighborhoods where we had to punish our way, to punish our way out of that, but we now needed to treat it as a health crisis. So things like that are subtle and not so subtle are how this structural racism manifests itself. An example that we see today are the disciplinary practices in schools. Dr. Joseph talked about that, the suspension and the expulsion of 5 and 6 year old African American boys and girls. And when their counterparts, it is seen simply not even as a behavioral issue. It's seen as a 5-year-old being a 5-year-old. They throw tantrums, they do things that are impulsive. But when it's an African American child, then it becomes a disciplinary issue that is taken often involving law enforcement. There is no 5-year-old on the face of the planet that has to be, that you need to involve law enforcement to address the issue. We saw just a few years ago some of the largest banks in this country, African American borrowers, Latino borrowers who had the same or higher credit scores, the same or higher net worths, were giving significantly more adverse loan terms, charged higher fees for no reason other than the fact that they walked into that financial institution as a Black borrower or as a Latino borrower. I think the experiences that we've seen in terms of employment, that a resume that has a name that is perceived as being an ethnic name or Black name, notwithstanding whatever the qualifications are not given the same review or opportunities. And I'll use myself as an example. Jay Williams is my nickname. I've been known as Jay for virtually my entire life. My given name is Roy Kojo Jawara Williams, which has origins in the African diaspora. My resume is my resume, but my resume, if I use my name Jay Williams, and my resume, if I were to use my given name Roy Kojo Jawara Williams, I promise you, it has been demonstrated that they will be perceived differently. Roy Kojo Jawara Williams is more likely not to receive a callback, is more likely not to receive an interview than Jay Williams, who, as you see, are the same people. So in those ways, whether we talk about employment, disciplinary action, if you talk about the median net worth, the net worth of Black households is 10 times less than that of white households. If you talk about the fact of economic mobility, a child who is growing up in a poor white household has a greater chance of moving up the economic mobility ladder than a child who is a Black child who is raised in an affluent household. So, there is no segment or no area of our society where this structural racism, this systemic injustices and disparities don't manifest themselves. And again, when it's visible and overt, people can point to it, see it, and understand it. But too often, it is just a part of the fabric of this country, a part of the fabric of our communities, that are just as detrimental, and perhaps I would argue even more detrimental, because people say, well, it's just you. The Black Americans just aren't making the right decisions. They're just not doing it right. Somehow they have brought this upon themselves with no appreciation for the hundreds and hundreds of years that the structure, that the systems have operated to, by design, if not overtly, subvertly, make sure that the African American community is not able to obtain the opportunities, the wealth, no matter how talented, no matter how well-intended they are. It is just the notion of, as Dr. Joseph has said, having to rethink and reimagine what our systems in this country look like.
Jay, can I ask you about your experience as the mayor of Youngstown, Ohio? In that role, you surely had to work with your police department on their use of force policies. How did you interact with your police department and address the issues of systemic racism?
That's a great question, and I have consistently, and to this day, have the utmost respect and appreciation for the men and women in law enforcement, but I'll share something with you that I haven't shared publicly that often. As the highest elected official in the city of Youngstown, I was fortunate to be the first African-American mayor. That did nothing to quell my anxiety when I found myself needing to often traffic through the police department. When a police car would be in the vicinity as I was driving through the city, the same sort of anxiousness. Was my seatbelt fastened? Was everything in a car in working order? So I want to start off by saying that with all the respect that I have for law enforcement, with my position as mayor, as the chief law enforcement officer of the city of Youngstown, as a Black man, I still had anxiety. I still did not always feel comfortable, not because any particular officer said or did anything to me, but because of how we had been conditioned with respect to law enforcement in the Black community. That being said, I was proud of the progress that was made with the Youngstown Police Department. I was proud that there were officers, men and women, who were eager to engage the community, to have a relationship with the community that didn't start with the badge and the gun and a uniform, that started with being fellow citizens of the same city, of the same community, and then began to manifest itself as we talked about issues of use of force, as we began to understand that there was an absolute need and role for law enforcement in our communities, but de-escalation and treating individuals like human beings was the first place to start before you had to then consider other uses of force. And don't get me wrong, I was one to say that if anyone pulled a weapon on one of my officers, the first and foremost was the safety of the officers and the people that they were charged to protect. But I also made it clear, the moment one of my officers crossed that line of morality or infringing upon the civil rights of a citizen, that officer would be held accountable as swiftly as anyone could imagine. So it is an imperfect approach to an imperfect system. While we made progress, there to this day still is significant room for improvement.
So Peniel, I want to go back to this idea of resistance movements today and the role of disruption, and the role in how disruption can be a factor in our society. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I want to amplify what Jay is saying by talking about the relationship between the institutions, whether you're talking about the federal or the state or the local level, and the relationship between Black misery or immiseration and suffering and trauma and white privilege and power, and then connect that to disruption. Because one of the things that I've seen as somebody who's been a student of this for over 35 years and also who's been an active citizen as well, is that the segregation that we have in the United States, and what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in terms of the redistribution of wealth and the way in which what scholars call racial capitalism works. And in this sense, it's sort of saying capitalism as an economic system since the origins of racial slavery is a system that is not an objective system. It's a system that is racist and discriminatory, but it's a system that globally makes money through not just the marginalization and exclusion of African-American bodies, but the exploitation of those bodies. So from that point of view, we say Black Lives Matter as this rhetorical slogan in this movement, but Black Lives really do matter to the rise of global capitalism. There's such great scholarship on capitalism and slavery. Sven Beckert has, Empire of Cotton. Craig Wilder has Ebony and Ivy, about the way in which higher education is implicated in racial slavery. There's the book, The Half Has Never Been Told by Ed Baptist. So we have these extraordinary books and scholarship and research on how sugar and cotton, and certainly the New York Times, the 1619 Project, is an extraordinary project that I would encourage everyone to go online, listen to the podcast, listen to the multimedia, get the actual paper. And that looked at racial slavery and race and white supremacy and racial caste from 1619 to the present. But I think everyone has to understand, my point is this: the reason why we have manicured white suburbs, better high achieving white schools, is precisely because of the immiseration of Black people. One doesn't work without the other. And that's why when Dr. King at the March on Washington said, we come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of American Justice is bankrupt, that's what he meant. And when he said shared sacrifice, and we're gonna have to struggle together, go to jail together, when people talk about white privilege, they're saying that there is a privilege that is constitutively a part of American democracy that is based on Black suffering. There's a real price that you pay being Black, and there's advantages that are real that you accrue in being white. And so we're trying to disrupt that. So we have to understand that there's going to be sacrifice. Just like when people say, if you have a critique of a patriarchal system or a heteronormative system, when you get more justice, there's going to be some suffering for people who've benefited from patriarchy. There's going to be some suffering from people who've benefited from heteronormativity. So that's the same when you think about racism. There's going to be some suffering. There's going to be a diminish and a loss for people who benefited from this system. So when you think about how do you disrupt the system, part of it is what we're seeing with white activists on the street, where you're using your privilege. And sometimes, you know, there's a white elderly man who just was really beaten by the police and shoved down. He tried to use his racial, his gender privilege, and the cops in Buffalo just completely brutalized. He smashed his head and he was bleeding in the scene we see. We're not sure how he's doing, right? So for all the protesters who are white, who've been hurt badly, who were nonviolently demonstrating, they've tried to use their privilege on behalf of racial justice. But what we're gonna see when we think about how do you disrupt this, this is making sure that in your communities, Black lives matter and they have access to the privilege of being in white communities. So white wealth is the product not of a meritocracy system, it's a product of the redistribution of Black labor through coercion, through terror, and policies. You know, Jay mentioned the Wells Fargo so-called mud loans. Wells Fargo made these racist loans during the Great Recession, right before the Great Recession. They targeted African Americans. They had to pay a fine, but we know this is documented evidence, right? So much of white supremacy is based on the plunder of Black lives and Black wealth. So that's why Sandy Darity has a new book on reparations, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates has the Case for Reparations Atlantic essay. There has to be reparations and we have to talk about that. That's what I'm saying. So we have to, the disruption is on multiple levels. It's on multiple levels. It's reimagining capitalism, a capitalism that is not racist, that's not racially stratified. It's saying that Black people are gonna have access to businesses and be entrepreneurs. It's reimagining anti-poverty and having community control and having whites who aren't necessarily trying to lead, but they're trying to be at the center of these discussions because their privilege and power provides more access for people who are poor, for people who are marginalized, right? And so when we think about disruption, we have to think that the way in which the status quo we have is actually predicated on the misery of others. That's just a truth that we are in constant denial about, right? We say American exceptionalism because of the brilliance of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, but their brilliance couldn't trickle down to 44 million other people. It doesn't work like that. The dignity and respect they were treated with, by and large, because obviously we know about the Tea Party, the birther movement, has not been accorded to other African Americans. So even when we have all these foundations, and I'm all for public-private partnerships, we have to reimagine, right, the way in which the privileges some have are really at the expense of the Black community. That's what we're saying, you know? And so even as, you know, you've got the president putting up a wall around the White House right now and security around the White House, we have put up metaphorical walls between the prosperity of white communities and the immiseration and the impoverishment of Black communities. And we've done it historically, but over the last 52 years, we've done it in an unprecedented way. We've managed to concentrate billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth in white communities at the expense of undervaluing even middle class and upper middle class Black communities, which is what Jay was saying. So even if you're the son or the daughter of Black doctors and lawyers in Prince George's County, which has got the highest per capita Black upper middle class in the United States. Generationally, you are going to have a harder time of reproducing their wealth and their access than a white counterpart who's born in a lower social economic tier. Why is that? That's because of the tiers of inequality and racism, where it's very hard for us to even reproduce generational wealth and generational high incomes. So we have so much work to do, but we have to, and we have a massive opportunity, but we have to admit what's happening to us. That's the whole thing. We have to admit, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult. This is very, very traumatic. Some African Americans I know, or really Black people, because Black is more inclusive. People have been asking me that too. What's more inclusive, African American or Black? Black is more inclusive because it's going to connect with the Caribbean. It's going to connect with people who might be Black immigrants. It's going to connect with Africa. So if anybody wants to know, Black is not some kind of slur. We are all very proud to be Black. Malcolm X was part of the person who made us proud to be from Negroes to Black. When people ask me, what do I think about people of color? I think that, you know, we can be very specific. Sometimes we can say non-whites. Sometimes people of color has become this catch-all phrase, right? And we don't want to talk specifically about Black dignity and Black citizenship. So I'd say be careful in terms of what group you're talking about, you know? And then finally, I'll say this, in terms of disruption, one of the things that white allyship can do is use the resources to help people like Jay Williams, in Hartford, use the resources. I run a Center for the Study of Race and Democracy in Austin. People are doing the anti-racist social justice work right now. Jay knows, we've been doing this for decades, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, even though I think we should push for experimentation. Part of it is using resources. The other is really listening and learning. There are a bunch of resources online. We'll put some books over here. My book, The Sword and the Shield, Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Stamped from the Beginning. He's got a young adult book, Stamped from the Beginners, about racism. There's a baby board book, Anti-Racist Baby. The book White Privilege, Tressie Cotton McMillan's book, Macmillan Cotton's book, Thick, and other essays. There are so many different, very, very useful books about anti-racism, but also giving us the history of what happened. So we can be disruptive in that way too. But finally, use, people who are on this call, this webinar in Hartford, people who are there locally, use your privilege to talk to your school districts about things like racial integration and giving kids a chance who need free lunches and who need social welfare to have a chance to be part of the supply chain of opportunity and privilege that you're part of. Talk to people in your community about density and giving people a chance to walk and have access to clean and safe neighborhoods and safe streets, and not think that the presence of a Black person is somehow going to diminish you. So talk to people, empathize deeply, get your faith communities, your civic communities together. Try to have Black history taught in your private school or your predominantly white public school at all levels, right? Try to bring in some Black teachers there too. So there's a way we can disrupt in a way that is not just about street protests and demonstrations. The demonstrations are very, very important. Protest and politics go hand in hand, but at the end of the day, this is going to be about thousands of new policy choices that we make in our day-to-day lives as citizens. Voting is just the tip of the spear of our identity as citizens.
Thank you, Peniel. Jay, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing at the Hartford Foundation to directly address some of what Peniel has just talked about?
Certainly. As a community foundation who's been around for 95 years, we have a mission to impact and advance the quality of life and living and vibrancy in the entirety of the region that we serve. In doing that, though, it became increasingly and has become increasingly evident based on the data, based on the well-being of our citizens, that we can't fulfill that mission if we don't acknowledge, call out, and begin to position ourselves to address the structural inequities and disparities that have existed for much longer than we have. So that is a shift that we have made, and it has been embraced by many. It has been questioned by some. Nevertheless, as we see the recent events, both in terms of the COVID pandemic and its disproportionate effect on Black Americans and others, both Black Americans specifically and people of color. And then that has been added to by this unrest we have seen. It has validated the approach and the strategic focus that we have taken. That being said, we also understand that we can't take it all on. We have limited resources. So to that end, we have focused are focusing on economic mobility. We are focusing on employment opportunities and wealth building for those segments of the population. We are focusing on student barriers to student progress and trying to create high opportunity neighborhoods, both in terms of safety, the ability to build wealth, and the resilience of those neighborhoods. So we have shifted our focus not to be exclusionary of the communities that we have served for so long, but to make sure that a part of every discussion of the limited resources we have, whether it's the grant making that we do, the public policy, the capacity building, serving as a convener, having a voice that carries hopefully some weight and some credibility, that the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving recognizes that we as a community foundation have a privilege and a platform, and that if we don't use that privilege in that platform to again acknowledge, call out, and begin to act by diverting, I shouldn't say diverting, by directing resources that we have at our disposal, that we have been given through the generosity of others, that we would not be able to ultimately fulfill that mission. I often, when talking to groups, they ask, what does philanthropy mean, or what is it about? And if you break down the two root words of philanthropy, both of Greek origin, phileo, meaning love, and anthropology, meaning mankind. Mm-hmm. Philanthropy about the love of mankind, and that includes all of mankind, but it also means recognizing that as human beings, there are those disparities that do not allow for Blacks, people of color, to enjoy the same opportunities, to enjoy things that some of our counterparts just absolutely take for granted. And it's not that we are angry that there are those opportunities that some people, or things that they don't have to think of, but where the anger is it isn't reciprocated. The empathy isn't there to understand, why the conditions that we see in our neighborhoods aren't conditions that were brought upon by something that Blacks did or didn't do, but to Dr. Joseph's point, these systems have been built to result in these outcomes. Yeah. Notwithstanding the best efforts, the most diligent, the intellectual achievements, the creative energies and talents that Blacks have, that notwithstanding all of that, that at the end of the day, the system was structured and designed to limit, to diminish, and to, in many instances, rob the value and the riches that were produced from that talent and from that work, and redistribute them to other parts of the community. So as a community foundation, we embrace our role. We embrace the mission that we have to the entirety of the community, but we also understand in achieving that mission to the entirety of the community, that for far too long, these structural inequities and disparities and racism have not allowed the entirety of the community to achieve, to experience the quality of life. And we can't do it alone. It has to be through partnerships, first and foremost, starting with the donors who give their time, their talent, their treasure. Also, then the organizations that we work with that are out there on the front lines, how do we support them? How do we lift them up? How do we help strengthen them so they can be more impactful? So throughout this process, it has been both frustrating, but also inspiring. And I appreciate, others such as Dr. Joseph, others such as the World Affairs Council, our fellow community foundations in our state and across the country for the role that we play. And the fact that, again, as we started off saying, that this perhaps is a seminal moment that can become perhaps a seminal and sustained movement. And that's the thing, when the cameras stop rolling, when the protests recede, we have to make sure that we don't fall back into, oh boy, we had a flurry of activity over a period of time, but then 3 months from now, let's say a vaccine is discovered and things get back to some semblance of normal, that we don't allow that normal to be, again, the normalization of the racism and the disparities and inequities, and thinking that somehow, we have made progress when all that's really happened is we return back to that sense of comfort that says it doesn't have to be too disruptive. And I'll end by saying, when Dr. Joseph said that there is no easy, comfortable way to address this systemic and structural issues, it does mean that some who have benefited disproportionately, if you've benefited disproportionately and all of a sudden you're getting your fair share, you're going to see that as a step back. But you don't recognize that for years and generations upon generations, you are getting benefits that you are not entitled to. So it is a messy, uncomfortable process, but a necessary process if we are ultimately going to achieve, I think, what so many now are beginning to understand and have aspirations for both our country and our communities.
So I want to let everyone know that we are working on putting together a list of resources. I can see that everyone is asking for them, and Dr. Joseph is posting his resources as well. So we will circulate those. We are quickly running out of time, but I want to ask each of you to end. We all talk about where do we go from here. Can I ask each of you to sort of outline what your best case scenario would be? Starting today, what's our best case scenario? Jay, can we start with you?
I would say, the best case scenario is that the feeling, the empathy, the understanding that perhaps is new to some, is renewed to others, allows us and causes us to have a sustained, ongoing, not just conversations, but actions around this, that when we don't satisfy ourselves after the election, if we have a leader that is more empathetic and understanding and capable, that we don't say, okay, we've arrived, we've done enough. That when there is not a viral video of a Black man being murdered, unconscionably and without reason, that we, become comfortable and say, well, it must not be happening. So the best case scenario is that we continue with, I think, the multi-generational, multicultural sort of protests, even if they manifest themselves in different ways. We absolutely need to be ready and still be in the streets protesting, but also the policies and also the practices and the approaches. So that's my best case scenario, that we have this sort of feeling for a sustained period of time that will ultimately begin manifesting itself in the dismantling of the system that we've been living with.
Dr. Joseph, what's your best case scenario?
Yeah, my best case scenario is really, it's going to take a work of a generation, but we have a generational opportunity to end racism and white supremacy. The way that looks now is that the end goal is that all the racial disparities we see in the United States of America, where African-American men and women are overly disproportionately represented in negative social economic indicators, death, breast cancer, premature deliveries, underweight babies, diabetes, smoking, incarceration, murder rates, lack of access to capital, credit, wealth, income gaps, living in environmentally unsafe places, all those things are transformed and look like their white counterparts. So when people ask me, how does the end of racism look? It means that, one, you're not going to be living in exclusively white privileged racial bubble, right? And that there's going to be no more George Floyd murders. There's going to not be disproportionate African Americans in prison. They're going to be friends of yours. They're going to be competitors of yours. We're going to finally have competitive capitalism where being white doesn't give you an automatic advantage within this system. So it's actually very, very attainable. We were coming closer in the 1970s demographically and economically than we are now. By 77, Black college attendance rates were right around the rates of their white counterparts, and it started to end. Black men going to medical school were right around the rates creeping up. They've stayed stagnant since 1979. That's because of anti-affirmative action. It's because of policy changes we made and said, hey, this is going to be too equitable and white supremacy resume. So if we defeat white supremacy, we're not going to have to go to the courts to have racially integrated schools and racially integrated neighborhoods. That's going to be part of our system already. And we're going to have deeper empathy for each other because we're going to live in a racially integrated society that centers racial justice as part of the beating heart of American democracy.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your hope with us too, because it's a very dark time, and it's encouraging to think that, you know, there could be some light ahead. It's going to be hard work and it's going to take a long time, but, you know, working together, hopefully we'll make some progress. I want to encourage everyone to join us for our workshop that follows this event. And Dr. Joseph, I hope that we can at some time soon welcome you here in Hartford. And we can see you in person. You too, Jay.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and well.